This is a production of Cornell University.
All right. So supporting each other through challenging times. That's what we've been doing. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Try to be safe out there. Love people sending pictures of them wearing masks. Especially people that travel around, sales force, people interacting with others. You know, there's places where you don't have to wear it. You know, you're outside, you got a lot of room. Maybe you don't have to wear it. But of course, if you're going to get it near anybody, certainly your fellow employees, you want to be careful about that. I just remind you again that our industry leaders, Professional Grounds Management Society, National Association of Landscape Professionals, as well as your local colleagues, have a lot of resources that you can draw on to make sure you're sort of keeping yourself safe and following all the guidance that changes very rapidly. Some of Matt's colleagues at Rutgers University, Meredith in particular, out of the diagnostic lab, providing some really good information on the kinds of sanitation of surfaces that you should pay attention to. You know, there was a lot of confusion. Just spray bleach? How do I do it? What's the solution? What's the best way to handle it? And I thought Meredith did a nice job. Big kudos to the Plant and Pest Advisory Service that I know our pal Rich Buckley's involved in. All right, well, working out there means a lot more vehicles on the road. And if you look at a local contractor that we work with down at our Greenwood project, Brightview, led ably by Enrique Levez, a longtime golf course colleague running the crews down there. You can see the amount of material that's coming out there to keep the workers safe. Bigger cabs, a lot more trucks, separating workforces, keeping them separate, making the distance. These are the kinds of adaptations we better get used to, because it looks like this is the way that business is going to get done, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, of course, there's always this option. Thought I'd pull this out of the old thing, the self-quarantining mower, so you can stay away from your wife and kids, which could be agreeable to many who are locked down with their spouses over long periods of time. All right, let's look at the weather. When we started about a month ago or more, now we're in our 7th week of this, it looked like the soils were coming on pretty good. In early April, we were in the mid to low 50s, and I'm sure Matt and I were talking about, wow, crabgrass could get going soon. Well, by the 29th, the end of the month, it had barely budged in the metropolitan area, but recently we're starting to see that surge over the last few weeks. Overall, you look at where we've been, we were about 3 weeks behind by the end of April, and we remain in many places 3 weeks behind, even in New Brunswick, where Matt is still a little bit behind. The projections now are not good. We're going to get snow up here on the weekend. We were laughing. It's okay to laugh about it, I guess. But we remain in single-digit accumulations. There's a significant part of the northeastern United States won't see an average temperature over 50 degrees for the next 5 to 6 days. So keep in mind that it looks like everything is going to remain in a state of suspended animation. and of course, here you have a zoysia grass lawn with some winter annuals or cool season grasses coming up in it. We're seeing this a lot throughout the Northeast, very typical in the metropolitan New York area. I actually took this picture when I was a kid in the 70s. I was fascinated by how this lawn was so brown even as a kid. Now, it's interesting. We're going to talk about weed control with my colleague Matt Elmore here in a second, but there's this movement afoot in the turf industry and beyond to begin to reintroduce clover into the lawn. This is some work that a PhD candidate out in Utah State University, Paige Boyle, is working on, interseeding clover with cool season grasses to enhance drought tolerance in particular is the one. And you can see some of the clover plots in this case look significantly greener in this picture that she just took very recently. Well, I'll welcome Matt to the chat here and just say, boy, I was like many in the early, just about last week, 4 or 5 days ago, we saw that little bit of snap weather that started the emergence call. And last week, Matt, I talked a little bit about the Fidanza model that he developed many years ago. And I don't, we could debate how accurate it is for it. But what I was saying last week is that you see in this case, you've got this really steep line where over a period of growing degree days, the germination occurs fairly rapidly. And then another study that was done out in Ontario, Canada, in some residential lawns where they showed emergence to be much flatter. Now, some of this could be a function of the way they accumulate degree days, but obviously I know you've been studying this. This has been important because of the variety of growth stages we could encounter as we see our pre's fail, or maybe improving our pre-emergent applications. We got to assume most people certainly have their pre-emergence down in the Hudson Valley and South. You did a wonderful job in your publication, Matt, on crabgrass and goosegrass, outlining the various options we have for this. Now, obviously, that's where I want to start our conversation for a minute now, and then I want to get back to some broadleaf discussion. So I've sort of talked a little bit about the grass emergence. Let's talk grass emergence. There's, stiltgrass, there's crabgrass, there's goosegrass, maybe even Kailinga, I think you said even emerged from rhizomes early.
Mm-hmm.
What's the cold weather doing to these emergence patterns? It looked like that little bit of warm weather gave us a flush, and now it seems like it's sitting there. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It depends on the weed a little bit. Crabgrass, some of it has come up. If you look at that Fidanza model, which I think models are a good guide, you never want to rely on totally. But that Fidanza model would show that there's been a little bit of emergence. I think when we get some really warm temperatures, we'll get more crabgrass emergence in even really dense turf areas. But yeah, the crabgrass came up, the stiltgrass came up. I was out a couple of weeks ago and noticed that the frost was actually having an effect on some of these weeds that had come. We had warm temperatures, and then we had a frost, and most of the crabgrass, I think, did okay through that. It survived. I think some of the stiltgrass probably, it just depended on the area, even microclimates, in terms of what got burned back. I saw a lot of stiltgrass that got burned back by the frost, a lot of Kailinga that got burned back by the frost.
So how worried are you that early applications that might have been made when we were sniffing germination late March, early April, how concerned are you about those petering out quicker, or has the longer, cooler temperatures probably left the barrier in place and you're probably still going to get your 12, 14, 16 weeks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think what we've seen is that if you apply, early, basically in, say, late February, early March, mid-March, whatever, you will lose a little bit of efficacy compared to maybe if you're applying, right at forsythia full bloom. And it really depends on the history of crabgrass at the site. So I'd say you could lose some efficacy. You wouldn't lose an entire month because the temperatures have been cool. This is a little bit of a guesstimation, I guess. But say if you applied 4 weeks early with cool temperatures, it might only be, you really only lose 2 weeks at the back end of that kind of thing. But yeah, these longer seasons are going to be challenging to these pre-emergent herbicides. Especially if it stays warm through the end of the summer. Jim Brosnan and I were just talking about this week in our webinar and on goosegrass, and we think regardless of what the weeds are, if you're going out early and the season is extended farther into even September due to warm temperatures, then you're just putting more pressure on those pre's, and we need to start thinking about having multiple strategies beyond just pre-emergent herbicides, or changing our pre-emergent herbicide application strategies. I think thinking about what you've done in the past, and if that's working for you, I'd say, you can continue on that course, trying to think about how the climate's changing. But I'd say if what you've been doing and it hasn't been working now multiple years in a row, you need to start thinking about it. Is it multiple applications? Do I need to really focus on improving that turf density in the spring and in the fall? Because that's really what's going to be our best defense. So yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is the seasons are getting longer, I think, and putting more pressure on these pre-emergent
So
herbicides.
what are some of these other strategies? And here's the thing you've taught me recently, and I wasn't paying attention, but we're getting more problems with different grasses. It's not just crabgrass anymore. And
Yeah.
it could be goosegrass. Obviously stiltgrass is in the shade, but if we just focus on crab and goose, what are some of the alternative strategies you guys are throwing around? I mean, do I want to put another pre that maybe hangs on too long?
Yeah.
What if it's not been working? Obviously, we'll assume that getting turf density is job one, but job two then is altering some kind of chemical strategy. What are you guys tossing around?
Yeah, I mean, so I think looking at some different, trying to make a pre-application at the appropriate timing before the plants come up, and then maybe trying to work in a post-emergence application later in the season to try to bridge that gap. Because like you say, you don't necessarily want to be applying a pre in late July or even mid-July. A lot of times if you're trying to, overseed in the fall or whatever, you don't want to affect the rooting of the turf grass and the potential for seeding. So yeah, I mean, what I've been telling a lot of people is just keep a post-emergence herbicide, on the shelf that you have available to use in the late summer. And the other really tough thing though is that the post-emergence herbicides, you really need to be scouting for the weeds, because if you wait until you have a goosegrass plant the size of a dinner plate, you're not going to be in a good spot for post-emergence herbicides. So I think, it's pre-emergence herbicides like, we've done in the past, but keeping an eye on models and plant phenological indicators to make sure you're making them the application at the right time. And then it's scouting the areas that you have the worst problem with the weed, trying to get out and scout those, at the right time. If you've got a pre, you might want to start scouting, like late June, early July, and get down in the canopy and try to look for those plants that are maybe breaking through that pre-emergence, because that's when we typically see them start to fail is, early to mid-July. You start to see all of a sudden, little crabgrass seedlings coming up. That's right. Where their control had been pretty good prior to that. So just try not to wait too long.
Listen, if it breaks down, I pulled up the slide here that you did in that publication. If it breaks down, you've got these options. Now, what I think is fascinating about this, and I wonder if you couldn't take a minute and talk about it, why doesn't quinclorac work in the 3 to 4 tiller stage? Have we ever figured out why drive just doesn't work when the plant's that age?
It's a good question. I don't know if anybody's ever figured it out. We just know that it doesn't work, right? Wasn't it Aaron Patton that did a lot of that work?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's ever been, the cause has ever been discovered. Have you? I haven't read anything on it.
Yeah, me neither. I thought maybe, since you've been fussing around with this, what I see is you don't really have quinclorac as an option for goosegrass.
Well, yeah.
And in fact, once it gets big, how confident are you that tepramazone or Pilex does the job really well? Because, that's our Achilles heel you are foreseeing being a problem, is a lot of our pre's don't get goosegrass. Yeah. You're going to get it, and then you have these post options. Can you talk a little bit about how good the post options are for goosegrass?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of pointed to the big problem is that once you get to 5 plus tillers on goosegrass, your only option is tepramazone, and it works fairly well, but you're probably not going to be making just one application once the plants get that large. So it's going to be multiple applications. And the other kind of scary thing is there's only one herbicide listed there. So if we look at a weed with potential to evolve resistance and goosegrass has shown the ability to do that, then it's kind of concerning. So we've actually been looking at, it's not listed in that publication, but we've been looking at mixtures of tepramazone and speed zone to try to, come up with some alternatives. But I think a lot of it's tough to do on a large scale when you're running, a large business, but trying to think about those cultural practices in the fall, because what we really found when we did a lot of that goosegrass emergence work was that even a relatively poor turfgrass canopy will reduce the number of seedlings that emerge by about 60 to 70%. So you think about even a poor stand of turf is really taking quite a bit of pressure off those pre-emergence herbicides in terms of the number of seedlings. A good stand of turf is going to do a lot more, and so I think that is important. And so if you're trying to come
So
up with
you're
a
saying,
plan,
you're saying, are you suggesting goosegrass isn't as competitive in a turfgrass stand because
uh,
it's maybe not getting hot enough, or is there something about it? Yeah, bring her
well,
over. See
yeah,
if she's got a goosegrass question.
yeah, I know she's climbing on the couch. My clock is ticking. Um, yeah, so I think it's interesting. We saw last year when we had a cool spring, the goosegrass didn't seem as competitive. It came up, and then we had a lot of cool temperatures, and it just never seemed to get going as bad as it did in 2018. So I think having that turf grass there in the beginning, good stand of turf in the spring to help outcompete those seedlings is really important. I think both crabgrass and goosegrass are competitive enough that if there's enough seedlings there, they're going to come up through a really dense stand of turf. But if you can take the pressure off of that herbicide as much as you can with cultural practices, especially with a weed like goosegrass that has this propensity to develop resistance. I haven't really put out the results yet, but we surveyed about 25 golf courses and athletic fields in New Jersey last year for resistance to dithiopyr.
Huh.
And we found that I think we had 23 populations that came up well and did well in our greenhouse trial. And I think we're still kind of trying to crunch the numbers a little bit, but it looks like about 17 of those 23 have some kind of resistance to dithiopyr. So now, of course, we went into areas where they've been had a history of goosegrass problems. They've been applying pre-emergence herbicides. It was primarily golf courses, but that was a little bit startling in terms of, wow, this weed may have evolved quite a bit under some of these selection pressures. So
Yeah, pretty rapid.
and I think the same thing could happen with Pilex if that gets used too heavily for goosegrass. So that's a big problem in the Mid-Atlantic. I don't think there's been some resistance to quinclorac reported with crabgrass a little bit, and phenoxyprop. I don't think that's as widespread though. So it's something to be concerned about with crabgrass too. But the big problem with both of those weeds is going back to that slide is when they get big.
Yeah.
There's nothing to control them. So I think knowing the site history is really important.
I know that the clock is ticking. I don't want her to fall off the couch. I want to get your sort of thoughts
good
on broadleaf weed control maybe before we take some questions.
Sure.
This is the model we use that was developed at Purdue many years ago. We still post it on our forecast website. And as you can see, it's indicating these early spring applications of the ester formulation at 2,4-D are they're starting to finally be favorable in your neck of the woods, but for much of the Northeast, not very good. Now, in addition to that, Matt, everybody notices these problems in the spring: ground ivy and violet. And so with that, the cooler temperatures, there you go. How's she doing? Bring her over.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So those weeds are sitting there. Is an herbicide application going to control them? How is this crazy weather going to affect our early spring broadleaf applications? Because I think puffballs are already through dandelions, and I don't think they maybe were ready to be controlled. What do you think about, we know it's not the best time to control weeds. What do you think about spring weed control? Broadleaf.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's possible that waiting until things get a little warmer, especially as you move north and on that map you showed, might be a good idea. And I think if you don't make those applications for dandelion control before they start to flower, then you might want to wait till after they are done flowering. There was some good work that Zane Rowdenbush at Ohio State did that showed if you're having problems with broadleaf weed control and dandelion control, if you apply in full bloom, those herbicides aren't going to work as well as if you get it either before or after the bloom. So we're not talking about waiting until July, but maybe waiting till late May. I mean, here we're probably a couple weeks away from being through flowering. But I would say if you get, north into Western New York and north, you're probably not, things are probably a little different. So yeah, waiting till the temperatures are warm is good. So yeah.
Yeah,
So
come on over.
I'll pass it. You want to come over here, Isla?
Yeah, come on over. There we go.
But yeah, I think waiting till temperatures are warm is important. Applying when we're getting nighttime temperatures in the 30s. It might not work
that's
well,
for and that's for controlling sort of simple to control weeds like dandelion. But then you get into ground ivy and violets, and my sense is, yeah, there she goes. That my sense is if there's not triclopyr in there, that
Right.
It's not going to work as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing with those weeds is product selection. Like you say, it's got to be triclopyr or fluroxypyr works pretty well too. So those sort of maybe products that are a little bit more maybe not as economical as just the 2,4-D MCPA dicambas. I think that's the big thing.
It's more product selection than timing.
I think it's both. I mean, what you've seen, the research shows that fall applications work well, but of course we're sitting here in spring, so we don't need to talk about that. We want a solution now, right? So,
right.
I think we're getting close to the window that would be ideal for those weeds. They're starting to metabolize, starting to grow a little bit more quickly.
Excellent. All right, Carl, I think we're ready for questions. How we doing?
Good. So there was one question about someone texted in the chat line about introducing things like heel all, or I think prunella, to bloom in the lawn during the summer. So I did send along a link to the Minnesota bee lawn. I know there's a little bit more of a push now to have lawns that have flowering weeds for the pollinators, but also kind of for aesthetic purposes. So I passed that link along in the chat box, and also Joellen Lampman in the New York State IPM office has a trial this year that she's doing with these pollinator lawns. So keep a lookout for that. And then just another question from Lori in the question and answer box. She's asking about consumer product selections for goosegrass. I don't know if there's consumer availability for those products. Do you guys?
Let's take the goosegrass question first, and then I want to talk about flowers and lawns. Go ahead, Matt. What about goosegrass question? What about consumer goosegrass?
Yeah, there are some products that contain phenoxyprop in the big box stores. I can't remember I can't remember the exact brand name, but there are some consumer products that contain phenoxyprop. I should remember because we have a publication on crabgrass and goosegrass control for homeowners. So if you Google, Rutgers Extension, we have a document for professionals. And then we also have a document specifically written for, homeowners. So Excellent. It kind of lists products that are, available in the big box stores as opposed to those that are going to be a lot of your local distributors.
Right.
So maybe check that out.
And I tell you, Carl, as you know, I brought up the clover point earlier, and you bring up the heel all and prunella and pollinator lawns. As soon as you start to introduce plants into a lawn that's not a grass, now you talk about limited chemical options if you want to go and blanket the place. That essentially limits almost all your options, Matt, right? Once you start having flowering lawns, and it changes the definition of sort of what a weed is to begin with. Yeah. And then really complicates your sort of any control you might want to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's probably would be nice to see more research on kind of how you implement one of those lawns so that you keep some grass in there, and because you want to have that grass to maintain your ground cover and your prevent.
Yeah, Dad has home.
Yeah, Elmo. I think
Dad Elmo.
I'm not sure.
This is so great. No extra charge for the family entertainment here today, Matt. This is so great. She's a doll. Right. What's her name?
Isla.
Hi, Isla. This is very strange, this world
everyone.
We live in, isn't
Carl,
it?
Did you find? Yeah, you found the publication. Okay.
Excellent.
Cool.
Yeah. So I put.
You can't spray anything for broadleaf weed control. So if they start to overwhelm the lawn, I don't know if you'd want to you think about seeding more in the fall to try to again keep some kind of turf there. I guess Paige is doing a lot of that work in Utah. So,
yeah. And one of the things is that as you try to establish any of these diverse lawns where you're introducing plants from seed, a lot of these natives and plants that we might want differently, like a Florida lawn or Tom Cook's Eco Lawn, if you're going to try seeding these things in, they're going to take a while to actually establish themselves. And Matt's right. We could use some research in and around the area of, a system of getting these lawns established. And then, it looks very different. And I'm actually thinking, Carl, maybe it's time to get Paige up early in the morning in Utah and have her here to talk about some of that clover work. Because even clover, Matt, doesn't that complicate? Not as much, but it complicates weed control. You can still do weed control in clover because 2,4-D doesn't get clover as far as I know.
Yeah, you're kind of limited to 2,4-D options. It'll suppress it, but you're right, it won't kill it. So, yeah, I mean, there's pastures that are managed with clover in them, so it can be done. It just kind of limits your options, and obviously, you're going to have to be a little bit more accepting of different species, maybe moving into the lawn occasionally and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it can definitely be done. It's just, it gives things a little bit more complicated or different than what we're used to doing.
Yeah. So let's wrap up here. The way I'm thinking about it is most people's pre's, if they went down, are still probably going to hold up because it's been fairly long. If you've had success with your pre-program, stick with it. If you're questioning it, start thinking about post strategies and how you'd implement scouting and try to rotate your products to get your grasses under control. And then the broadleaf thing is a combination of both product selection and timing. And that's why, of course, now they sell, Q5 or Q8, whatever it is, Matt, that's got every active ingredient known to man in a single compound, in a single product. So that's still going to be timing based for good efficacy. And no one wants to hear it, but the best time to do this is in the fall, and sort of we're catching up now. So
yeah. And one thing,
Carl, anything else? Or go ahead, Matt.
One thing I'll add on the pre's is that we just did some work that I think it's in crop, forage, and turf. But when we looked at those early applications, we looked at early pre-applications in late February, thinking there might be some end users that want to get out early, start going because they got a lot of accounts to get to. And we found that those late February applications were not as effective as those made at Forsythia full bloom, but that if you made a reapplication, not 6 to 8 weeks after your late February application, but 6 to 8 weeks after Forsythia bloom, those work just as well as applications made at Forsythia bloom, a single application. So to summarize that, if you're making an early application, make the next, and you want to use a split program, make the next application not 6 to 8 weeks after the initial application, but 6 to 8 weeks after Forsythia full bloom. Because of that, they're not breaking down very quickly right now. So you don't have to make, again, that re-app at 6 to 8 weeks after the application, but rather the Forsythia full bloom. At least that's what we've done.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that paper. That's got to be one we'll make sure we set up a link to if we can get at it. Matt, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to your daughter for the cameo appearance. She's just a doll there.
Yeah, we're stuck like this until I don't know, things get a little more back to normal. So mom's working. So
yeah. Well, I heard they kicked Buckley out of his bedroom and sent him back to the lab.
Oh, they did? I didn't know that.
It's very good. All right. So Carl, survey.
Yep, I just put the link again to our survey. So, thanks to everyone who's already filled it out. I know we're getting, 45 responses, I think, already so far. So, but if you haven't, go check that out real quick. And I think that's it for today. Right on the money, Frank, half an hour exactly. Matt, again, thanks for joining us. Big shout out to your wife who's in the healthcare industry and on the front lines there. So thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Take care. See you guys.
Way to break up our Friday. See ya.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.